This week we're going to go through chapter 17 about government and legal issues and compensation. And I'm putting this chapter sort of at the beginning of our class instead of waiting until the end of the class, like the textbook would suggest, because a lot of the decisions that we make around our compensation systems and even about how we're going to implement our compensation strategy is going to have to deal with some of the laws that we'll learn about in this chapter. So I would rather that you understood or were at least aware of those laws from the beginning of the class so that it makes more sense about how you follow the law and regulations in creating a compensation system than to learn about how we create compensation systems and then suddenly you realize there's some laws and regulations we may or may not have been following that you do need to be aware of, because if you did this in real life, you would have to follow these laws. A lot of these you have seen before. These shouldn't be new if you've taken an introductory human resource management class, but this is kind of a rehashing of some of those laws you've learned before and then specifically applying them to compensation. With that in mind, I do want to say there's two caveats to this chapter. One, this chapter is super, super long. You don't have to know everything in this chapter. What I would do is I'm going to cover some of the material in these videos, but because this chapter is so dense, I want you to use the notes outline to follow the textbook chapter, so the chapter in the textbook, to see what I've said you don't need to know, including there's a lot of laws in one of the graphics at the beginning of the chapter. You don't have to know most of those laws. The only laws you need to know are the ones I've asked about in the outline for the chapter. There's even sections of the chapter I don't even cover. And then toward the end of the chapter, there are a lot of details where you don't need to know those details to understand the basic premise of the content of the book. So please go back to the chapter outline notes for this chapter in particular to see what you do and don't need to know, because there's a lot of things I'm not going to include in the videos so that you don't have hours of videos to watch, but also because there's a lot of stuff in that chapter that's just not relevant, I think, for our class. So let's get started with the kind of introduction to the legal landscape. A lot of this you'll already know, so hopefully this is old hat for you, but in case you don't, I want you to have a context about why we have all the laws and regulations in this chapter. So a lot of these laws and regulations were based on problems that we had with compensation in terms of historical practices. And historical practices here means mostly discrimination. So it used to be completely legal, even half a century ago, to discriminate toward women, toward people of color, toward people with a disability, lots of different things that we could discriminate against with people in terms of compensation. We could pay you less. We could not hire you. We could not put you in the same kinds of jobs as other people. We didn't have to give you a promotion. You didn't have to get a pay increase. You might not have been eligible for a bonus because you were in a group that happened to be something that was common, a group of people who were commonly discriminated against. They were not decisions that were made that were job related. So the way that we fixed these problems was to create a lot of laws and regulations, which is what we'll learn a few of them in this chapter. And part of that is because we should always keep in mind that one of the objectives of our compensation system is to comply with the law and regulations, but also to be fair to employees. And these laws were meant to be fair for employees. But I'm sure, as you know, and there are examples in the book, a lot of these laws did solve some of the problems they were supposed to solve, but some of them created either new problems or didn't fully solve the problems that we have around discrimination. And in fact, we still have court cases for a lot of these issues because this discrimination is built into some of the systems and institutions that we have to deal with, and so it can be hard to get rid of. Another reason that we have some issues with these laws not solving the problems completely that they were supposed to solve is that they are enforced by different agencies through rulings in the courts, through regulations that are created by those agencies, through inspections by people who are certified to go into businesses and see how they're doing business, and by investigations when a claim has been filed that something's happening that's discriminatory in that workplace. Each branch of the federal government, the legislative, judicial, and executive branches all have a role in this compliance, which means you have lots of different people who may comply with these laws or use compliance in very different ways. And then you also have state and local laws that you'll have to follow. We're not going to go through those laws in this chapter, but if you are doing this as part of your job, you're going to want to be familiar with what the state and local laws are as well, because every state and locality will have some laws that will apply to compensation that you'll need to know. So in this first video, we're going to go through the first big law that is in this chapter, and that's the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, of 1938. Be aware that this was passed during the Great Depression, so a lot of the provisions were very new at the time, but they're pretty old hat now. So the FLSA covers all employees of companies engaged in interstate commerce or the production of goods for interstate commerce. So for most nowadays, for almost all companies, that would mean that they're all under these provisions. Almost every company that sells anything is going to have people who are buying that on the internet. And so they're going to be selling from one state to another, which is interstate commerce. And so they fall under FLSA. There are some exceptions, but you will not need to know the exceptions for the test. The three major provisions that we're going to talk about from the FLSA are minimum wage, the number of hours of work, and also who gets overtime and when, and then child labor. There is also an additional provision that you need to be aware of in terms of compensation, that organizations have to keep records about who their employees are, how many hours they've worked, and what they got paid for those hours worked. So there's a lot of great exhibits or figures in this chapter that I think are really helpful at understanding what the landscape looks like right now with these laws and how they're enforced. So this is exhibit 17.3 from the chapter, and this is the wage and hour settlements by type of claim for the FLSA. So the FLSA has ways that either employees or people who are familiar with the way that organizations do business can file claims saying that organizations are not following FLSA regulations. The biggest one, as you can see on this chart, is overtime. There are lots of places that have employees working overtime and then don't pay them the overtime pay that they should get. And this can be through different ways. So one of them is off the clock. That's the second category here. That's when you have employees working overtime, but then you ask them not to record that overtime in their hours worked. You can also misclassify your employees. And if you go into the textbook, they have some very good recent examples of when these kinds of FLSA regulation claims have been made and what happened to those claims. But a misclassification would mean that you have someone who's really an employee, but you're classifying them as an independent contractor, which is cheaper because you don't have to pay them benefits. You may even not have to pay them as much money, but they're really acting as employees instead of independent contractors. You also have people who miss meals and breaks, which are by law. If you're an hourly worker, you have certain amounts of time. If you work 4 hours, for example, you get a 15-minute break. And then minimum wage, people who are not being paid the minimum wage that they are expecting. There's some industries that have the most claims. And if you've ever worked in these, you might understand why. Food and food services and transportation and shipping, especially at the bottom, those are two industries where time is very important. So a lot of times, in order to save time or to not have to pay if things are taking too much time, that's where you might see some of these claims against the regulations for FLSA and organizations. Retail can also be one where you have a lot of customers and time becomes an issue. These are food and food services and retail are also very low paying industries. Generally, they have a lot of entry-level workers who are getting minimum wage or just above minimum wage. And so in those kinds of industries, you also have a lot of organizations trying to skirt around the law sometimes. And then financial services and insurance are often people who are trained in some of these regulations, but they're also very good with finances. And so they may be doing some changes in their books that end up with these kinds of claims where they're not, giving overtime to employees or they're not even recording overtime work. The second, the minimum wage is the first major provision that we're going to talk about here. And this is intended to provide an income floor or at least a minimum of what workers in society's least productive jobs can make. When the book talks about least productive jobs, what it means here is, if you remember, going back to chapter 3, where we talked about how much organizations might make off of their employees in terms of the goods and services they make. A low productive job would be a job where the organization that has these employees makes very little above the amount of money it costs to make the goods and services those employees either make or provide. So that the marginal productivity is very low in these industries. So that's why things like food and food services and retail, for example, and even shipping and transportation have a lot of these regulation issues because they're they don't make a lot of profit essentially from their employees. The current federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. And in Kansas, it's $7.25 an hour. We are not a state that has a different minimum wage, but 45 other states do have their own minimum wage, including Washington, D.C. If you're in a state that has its own minimum wage, the employees who are making minimum wage will always make whichever is the higher amount, either the federal minimum wage or, it's almost always going to be the state minimum wage. 1.6 million U.S. workers are paid at or below minimum wage. They may be below minimum wage because they make money off tips. If you're in food service, for example, it could also be that you have workers who are illegally being paid below minimum wage or being paid under the table where it's not even recorded. When we want to make changes to minimum wage, essentially changes are almost always an increase in minimum wage. There can be some direct and indirect effects for employees and organizations. For employees who are making minimum wage, when minimum wage changes, it means that their pay increases. But the indirect effect, if you recall from chapter 3, we have differentials in our pay grades. Like as we're going up our hierarchy in our organization, we have some certain differentials that we are putting into our compensation system because that's part of our strategy. If you have your lowest paid employees getting a pay increase, you often have to increase the pay of everyone else in order to keep those differentials the same as they were before. A lot of organizations, when there's talk about increasing the minimum wage, will push back against it and say, oh, well, if you increase minimum wage, that increased the cost for us to do business, and we're going to have to pass that cost on to our customers. We may have to hire fewer employees. We may even go out of business. If I would go back to the book here and just look and read the few paragraphs that are about minimum wage changes, as we've seen from the few localities and a few states who've increased their minimum wage in recent years, a lot of these negative outcomes for organizations either never happen or they don't happen to the degree that organizations fear. So yeah, a few people may lose their jobs, but it's not that many people, and many more people actually are making a wage that's at least more livable. The second provision we're going to talk about is overtime and hours of work. So I'm going to clarify something I think the book doesn't do a good job here. This is where you've heard of exempt and non-exempt employees. Exempt means that you're exempt from the overtime provisions of the FLSA. Non-exempt would mean you are not exempt from those provisions. So a non-exempt employee is not exempt from the overtime provision of the FLSA, which means they are required to make time and a half when they work over 40 hours a week. So if you're making minimum wage at $7.25 an hour, and you are a non-exempt employee, you will make $7.25 up through 40 hours a week. On your 41st hour, you will make $7.25 plus half of $7.25, which is about, I don't know, about $3.65. So you'll make somewhere around $10.80 for every hour now that you work over those 40 hours. Many employees, and many of you will be in these jobs, will be exempt from these overtime provisions. Often you are paid a salary if you're exempt, so you get paid a certain amount of a chunk of money regardless of how many hours you work in a week. There are also certain jobs that the law requires to be exempt from overtime pay. So I want you to be aware of these, but you don't have to know the details about all of these exemptions. But there's an executive exemption for those who have a lot of leadership or power over making decisions in an organization. There's administrative exemptions for people who are working as administrators or working with those leaders. There's professional exemptions for people who have higher education degrees like a master's or a PhD, or some kind of professional degree, or who are in creative professions where they have a lot of autonomy or ability to make decisions. Computer employees are exempted. Outside sales exemption. Outside sales means that they make sales outside of the building they work in. So you're not in a retail store where you're waiting for customers to come in, but rather you can leave that retail place and go out and go work in a district or a region and try to get sales. And then highly compensated employees are also are exempt from overtime pay. However, there are some jobs in this law that are not exempt from FLSA, and these include what we call blue collar jobs. So essentially jobs in construction and manufacturing where you're doing manual labor. Those are not exempt from FLSA, and part of that is because it's a safety issue. These people are doing manual labor. If they're working overtime, they're more likely to be fatigued. They are more likely to have accidents, and thus they need to be paid more for the work that they're doing because it's becoming more dangerous over those 40 hours. The third provision that we're not going to talk a lot about is child labor. And so the only two things that really are in the book that you need to know for the test are that people under 18 can't work in hazardous jobs, such as meat packing and logging, because they're dangerous. And these are children. They often aren't very tall. They aren't very strong yet, but they're also very young. So they just shouldn't be doing hazardous work. It's more hazardous for them than it is for the adults. People under 16 can't be employed in jobs that involve interstate commerce. So anything where goods are being sold or services across state lines, they can't be employed in those kinds of jobs, except when that work is not hazardous, meaning it's not dangerous at all, and it's for a family business. So this is where you might go to a restaurant, for example, and see that there's a child who's essentially working at the front, who's putting people on at seats or whatever. They may even be servers in that restaurant. It's usually a family business at that point, and it's allowed because it's a family business and it's not hazardous work. That means also that a lot of organizations that you'll work for, or that maybe you've tried to get jobs at before, a lot of them aren't going to hire people under 16 because they're not family businesses. These are not their children that are working there. And or they may have work that can be hazardous, so certain jobs are off limits to people under 18.